Hey guys, we're going to continue our discussion of period 6 and key concepts. Today we're gonna continue to look at the ideologies of anti-imperialism and how they contributed to the dissolution of empires and the restructuring of whole new nations. So, national leaders and parties in Asia and Africa challenged imperial rule. You had the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. In Vietnam, you had Ho Chi Minh, who we already talked about, who led the nationalist revolt against the French. And in the Gold Coast, you had Kwame Nkrumah, who's pictured right here, who fought for independence from the British and became the first prime minister of the African nation of Ghana, which the Gold Coast was called after it gained its independence. However, regional, religious, and ethnic movements challenged not just colonial rule, but also the imperial boundaries that were inherited from that colonial rule after independence. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is pictured here in the center, was the leader of a group in India known as the Muslim League. And he is one of the main reasons why India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. He wanted a Muslim majority nation because he did not trust that Muslims would ever be truly safe in the Hindu majority of nation of India. In Canada, you still today have a sizable number of Quebecois people who want Quebec to secede or separate from Canada because it is culturally more French than the rest of the country. And in Nigeria, the Igbo people carried on a secessionist movement known as the Biafra secessionist movement, wanting to create a separate Igbo state in Nigeria. Transnational movements also sought to unite people across national boundaries, and of course we have the old Marxist communist idea of unifying all workers and establishing a classless society. Communism is technically not a nationalist ideology, although we'll see later on, especially under Stalin, you're going to see later on that nationalism becomes an important part of Soviet propaganda. Another movement that rises up is led by this gentleman right here, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a general in the Egyptian army that overthrew the king that had been backed by the British government and became a key figure in the Pan-Arab movement. And this is the idea that the idea of unifying the Arab people across Arab lands. Pan-Africanism is a major movement during this time, led in part by Kwame Nkrumah, but you also have leaders from throughout the world. Marcus Garvey in the United States is part of the Pan-African movement. Later on, Malcolm X is going to kind of contribute to that, and of course some civil rights leaders like Kwame Ture, who before had been known as Stokely Carmichael, begin to turn to Pan-Africanism, this idea of all people of African descent throughout the world uniting for empowerment and strength. So these are other movements that were even against nationalism or a different understanding of nationalism. And movements to redistribute land and resources developed within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sometimes advocating communism and socialism. Generally, these movements are met by resistance from the United States, obviously, and oftentimes the U.S., in the name of trying to halt the spread of communism, will support dictators and things of that nature. These political changes were accompanied by major demographic and social consequences of the period. A redrawing of old colonial boundaries led to population displacement and resettlements. We see this in the partition of India as the British divide their old colony of India into India and Pakistan. So Muslims in India scramble to move to Pakistan because they're only given, I think, a month to make the move. And Hindus in Pakistan are scrambling to move to India. And what happens is these groups often intersect on the roads and the railroads and the byways of the former colony of India. And so you have ethnic or religious violence that occurs during that period. Of course, the Zionist settlement of Palestine, what will become Israel, results in the displacement of Palestinians. And there are still massive Palestinian refugee camps as settlements continue into formerly controlled Palestinian territories. Of course, the division of the Middle East into British and French mandates causes upheaval as well. You also have, though, the migration of former colonial subjects to the imperial metropoles, to the countries which colonized them. This is especially true of South Asians to Britain, so people from India and Pakistan moving to Great Britain after World War II, Algerians moving to France, and Algerian immigrants are still a major population group in France, specifically in French cities, and Filipinos to the United States. Filipinos who had been under U.S. colonial control for the previous 4 or 5 decades. Basically, you have a lot of immigration from that population into the United States. And of course, these conflicts or these demographic and social consequences also emerge from the conflicts themselves and the genocide and ethnic violence that emerges. The Armenian genocide in World War I being a prime example. Of course, the Holocaust during World War II is probably the most famous example, but you also had the genocide of Cambodian people by the Cambodian government under the leadership of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. And later, more recently in the 1990s, the genocide of Tutsis by the majority Hutu in Rwanda. Over 1 million Tutsis are killed in just about a month. It was a very dizzyingly fast genocide. At the same time, the wars themselves occurred on an unprecedented global scale. World Wars I and II were both what we call total wars, where societies were completely mobilized. Governments were mobilizing all elements of their societies to try to win the wars. And they used a variety of methods to do this. Fascism, fascist corporatism is what it's called. Basically, the co-opting of private business to push for the war effort. Of course, communism in the Soviet Union, you had war communism in World War II, and basically very strict production goals and things of that nature. And even in the United States, you had the appeal to nationalism in its attempts to produce for the war, and all of these focused on or used heavily propaganda from to try to stir their nation on. And in the case of these conflicts, the sources of the conflicts varied. Some were a reaction to imperial expansion, much like World War I. You see there Gavril Princip assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia, thus ending the grand love story that I told you about in class. And some were actually reactions to the economic crisis of the Great Depression. Here you see German children during the Great Depression using bricks of German currency as building blocks because it was so worthless that children used it for toys during this time period. So what we see is because of the conflicts, the global balance of economic and political power shifts. through World War I, and especially after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as superpowers, which leads to ideological struggle between those two nations as representatives of capitalism and communism. And the Cold War produces new military alliances, including NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and promoted proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, Asia. So you see things like the Vietnam War occur because of, well, at least are continued because of the Cold War. And although conflict dominates much of the 20th century, many people, many groups opposed this trend. You had the rise of nonviolent political protest during this period. On the same token, or on the opposite side of the coin, you did have groups that intensified conflicts as well. Some groups and individuals that challenged wars of the century and promoted the practice of nonviolence as a way to bring out peace. Groups and individuals who challenge war include artists such as Pablo Picasso, who produced the famous painting Guernica. Guernica, is a depiction of the Nazi and Italian bombing of the Spanish city of Guernica as part of their support for Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Of course, you had the anti-nuclear movement during the Cold War, and maybe one of the most famous acts of nonviolent protest, or at least nonviolent toward others protest, is the protest of Thich Quang Duc, who was a Buddhist monk protesting against South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem and his persecution of Buddhists during the 1960s. And actually, his act of self-immolation is one of the most singularly famous forms of social protest in the 20th century. Of course, there were other individuals promoting nonviolence as a method for political change. Mohandas Gandhi, which I have misspelled there, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, who followed Gandhian principles of nonviolence. And also, to a point, Nelson Mandela. The reason I have sort of is because Mandela did, along with the rest of the African leaders of the African National Congress, originally believed that nonviolence was the best method to defeat apartheid. But after the Sharpeville massacre, the ANC, Mandela included, starts to turn to more violent methods. You also have groups and individuals, including the non-aligned movement of countries that sought to stay neutral in the Cold War, opposing and promoting alternatives to existing economic, political, and social orders. You had the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, led by Mandela. You had the participants in global uprisings throughout the world in 1968, the Tiananmen Square protesters in 1989, and there's the famous tank man of Tiananmen Square there. And militaries and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflicts in ways that further intensified the conflict. You had the promotion of military dictatorships in Chile, Spain, and Uganda by the United States and other countries who were trying to prevent the spread of communism. And you had the buildup of military-industrial complex and weapons trading that spread these types of conflicts throughout the world. Other movements used violence against civilians to achieve political gains. The Irish Republican Army trying to gain Irish independence from England. ETA, which is a Basque nationalist movement trying to gain independence from Spain. It's up in the northern corner of Spain. And of course, Al-Qaeda, who carried out the attacks on 9/11, were trying to strike at what they considered American cultural imperialism and hegemony. So you have lots of examples also of violent reactions to the political order that emerges in the post-war period. So we'll finish up in your third installment here shortly. Talk to you later. Bye.